You're watching Deprogrammed. My name's Harrison Pitt. I'm a writer for the European Conservative, and I'm delighted to be joined today, as ever, by Evan Riggs, who is a freelance journalist, and our special guest, Connor Tomlinson, who is a host at the Lotus Eaters, a well-subscribed podcast with which you're likely to be familiar. Now, Connor, Evan and I were both interested recently to read your piece in The Critic, where you had the temerity to suggest, despite being a man yourself, that it's probably women who've suffered most from the sexual revolution. I'm going to read a quote from it quickly because I'd like you to explain this. Quote, "The endless search for autonomy will leave you sterilized. Only when sex-embedded power dynamics are embraced as complementary will sex and civilization be good again." Can you explain to our viewers what you mean by that?
So, as I put in the article, this idea came out of a conversation I had with Mary Harrington, of where she objected to Generation Z and some of the later millennials performing as trad wives and the like on TikTok. And she said it was some kind of artifice of a tradition that was a bit of a economic, cultural aberration, because the exact amount of money that the boomers had, the disposable capital in the 50s and 60s to allow women to stay at home and be purely confined to the domestic sphere, was a blip in time compared to how men and women operated for hundreds of years. And she said, in contrast, the left-wing version of that is quote-unquote kink culture. And to put it PC, there is a reason, for example, that 50 Shades of Grey was one of the best-selling books at the same time that feminism exploded in the cultural zeitgeist. And the reason is, and this is what she said, kink is a kind of nature reserve for libs who want equitable power dynamics in every other sphere of life except in the bedroom. Exactly, put it perfectly. And so I said, as I've been talking to her offline, accepting and going along with naturally embedded disparate power dynamics is going to be much better than constructing all of your intimate personal and broader economic and political relationships around having a golden parachute that you can pull at all times, which is total financial independence and total emotional independence from someone you're meant to be reliant on. And it's funny, so you've located it in the sexual revolution. Ivan Illich, who's an interesting author, he wrote in the 80s a book called Gender. And he uses gender in a really weird way, and I think we need to, as a culture, retune our language around that, because the feminists have captured it as to mean this performative Judith Butler-esque style costume which is confining men and women. He said, no, the distinction between gender and sex is actually a post-industrial problem, of where the Industrial Revolution was a disjunction from how men and women naturally cohabited, worked to stave off privation, collaborated, and had marriages of kind of economic necessity, but also we got along. You know, we were mutually struggling upwards and nobly. As soon as the Industrial Revolution came along and made it so that lots of women couldn't work on their domestic sphere, it outsourced a lot of their work to the public sphere. Then that sex distinction was made all the more apparent, and so because the feminists then came along and said, right, okay, well, women are at a disadvantage, so we need to conscript them into the market and they need to have complete economic independence. Then you have these pressures to make women compete on the same terms as men. There's a reason that Simone de Beauvoir finished her 800-page tome of utter waffle, The Second Sex, with the word brotherhood. And it's because technologically, culturally, we needed to level out women's reproductive capacity, their personal interests. You need to propagandize out of them women's personalities in order so that they can compete for the same resources in the market as men on the same terms as men. And what that's led to is men and women being at each other's throats for the last 50 odd years, and people being so completely dissatisfied that now women are turning around and going, well, where are all the good men gone? And 50.2% of women, I think it was reported in The Guardian last year, have no children by the time they're 30. It's something that Stephen Shaw said, we're going to be facing the pandemic of unplanned childlessness of 800 million people by 2050 who wanted kids and didn't have them. And then on the flip side of that, 27% of men 18 to 30 report having no intimate partners in that time. So there's a giant crisis of millennial, Gen Z people who have been disserved by the industrial and sexual revolutions, who are saying, well, all I wanted was 100 years ago I would have had a family and a house. I mean, I'm in this camp, you know. And now what has sexual or political liberalism really done for me? How much of it do you think has to do with the fact that we in the modern world, we live amid such plentifulness in many ways, that it becomes easy for people to, particularly if they're older, to convince younger people that it's almost as though they can have anything, and that there are no such things as trade-offs in life fundamentally. So if it's something, I don't know, for example,
most women, by the time they hit their 30s, will begin to, young women today, but by the time they hit their 30s, they will begin to acknowledge that, you know, having a child might not be the worst idea in the world. You know, it's almost as if that natural calling becomes all the more urgent at that time in their lives. Yet if they've lived their 20s in such a way that they weren't expecting to hit that sort of time horizon, they're going to be extremely disappointed. And I wonder if we're doing a real disservice to young women in particular by convincing them that you can both chase the bag, as it were. You can be a sort of, you know, a career woman, and also you can revert back to your natural calling in your 30s when you know it's going to be much harder to achieve that form of life at that point.
Well, men and women aren't in a mentally preparatory state to be parents because you've elongated adolescence until your mid-20s because of education. And then, again, the entitlement schemes that have been slowly creating an inverse economic and demographic pyramid with the boomer generation. And don't get me wrong, both my grandparents are alive and, you know, I want them to live in relative comfort. But let's put it this way, the pension system, relative to inflation, is not economically sustainable because the money just isn't there. They're taking it directly from us at the moment, and so that's going to go kaput. And so us lot, lads, we've kind of got an opportunity ceiling above our head of where we're going to be one of the first generations in the world who have more commodities, more disposables at our fingertips than ever, but no actual tangibles. You know, we don't have homes. Many of us don't have homes, don't have families, we don't feel anchored, we're kind of rootless. And so that bled over into the attitude, and this is why I put it at the heart of liberalism. I know there's a hell of a lot of commentators on the right, prominent figures, James Lindsay's one of them, Jordan Peterson and the like. They've pointed out where lots of modern pathologies have their roots in Marxism. And that's totally true for the likes of Simone de Beauvoir, the critical race theorists. But Marxism and liberalism are two cheeks of the same post-Enlightenment backside because they're aiming at the same problem. They're aiming at total autonomy, total solvency of the individual from social bonds, and at the same time, the maximum amount of material goods they can get without having to depend on anyone. And that's why liberalism has jumped, sexual economic liberalism, has jumped from the kind of Lockean compromise that they had, of where, okay, you give up some of your rights for protections from the state and you can coexist with people cooperatively and peacefully, to Rousseauian liberalism of where, okay, if there is an injustice in society, it is the state's job to iron that out because it is perceived as an incursion on your autonomy because you didn't freely choose the relationship, like having a child. That means that you can either outsource it to a surrogate or abort it at any time you so choose, and that you shouldn't have a physiological dependency on that child, or you shouldn't even be intimately connected with your own body. So you can mix and match parts with trans ideology. This is why the Marxists, and also I think it was Mao quote that said, nature is a revolutionary enemy. Well, Jordan Peterson was pretty prescient back in 2018 with Kathy Newman saying the Maoists and the trans activists have the same idea. So do liberals. At any point, if there is an incursion on your ability to make a free choice, whether that's biological, whether that's relational, then that has to be completely eliminated. And all that's left us is in a listless place of where we're basically Rousseau savage, aiming around in a civilization full of abundance, but without anyone to depend on. And has that made us happier? I mean, I can't say it has.
So what you're saying is liberalism is fundamentally unsexy?
Yeah, well, so Mary Harrington decided to tweet out my article with a meme that she said was too toxic for Maine, but she just decided to roll with it. And her one was make government kinky again, which was kind of the thesis I got to there. And the reason you jumped to that, and that was one of the paragraphs I put in there, was, okay, if abstract hypotheticals like total informed consent, which again the government don't seem to be wanting to give us regarding vaccines and lockdown, but neither here nor there. If that abstract hypothetical is being pursued, then okay, if your rights are on paper, if they're abstractly codified, but you aren't substantively represented in Parliament, you didn't get what you voted for, Brexit in name only, for example, every single manifesto saying we're going to lower migration and them never doing it. What use are abstract rights and consent on paper if you're not living necessarily a good life? Yes. If the heuristic for a good life is how much GDP can you contribute every year as a consumer or a contributor? If you don't have an intimate family, if you're not belonging to a community, if you don't feel you have substantive representation in Parliament or substantive power on the local level, then what use is an abstract hypothetical like consent or freedom? And so
it goes back to, there's a wonderful quote by Matthew Arnold, which I think is incredibly instructive and illustrative on this point, and I agree with most of what you just said about Marxism and liberalism. That goes back to one of my favourite quotes by Matthew Arnold, which I think is extremely instructive and illustrative on this point, where he makes it very key that freedom isn't, you know, an unalloyed good unto itself. He says freedom is a fine horse to ride. It's an instrumental good in that way. It's something that we need in order to flourish, but it is not flourishing unto itself. He says freedom is a it's a fine horse to ride, but to ride somewhere. So one thing that I certainly prefer about the Anglo-American understanding of freedom is that it makes a point of making them plural and enumerating them. So it talks about basic freedoms and thought, speech, liberty, thought, speech, assembly, conscience, these sorts of things. These freedoms are made incredibly particular, so that they're not vulnerable to tempting people into thinking that the sort of liberalism they should entertain is one which is incredibly proselytizing and which is always seeking to corrode exactly the sort of social bonds, many of which are just as crucial to our flourishing and maybe involve duty as those basic freedoms themselves. So in order for freedoms in the plural sense and duties to be brought into a harmonious realignment, it requires a continuous tradition rather than a perpetual war against any kind of social bond, whether it's the bond between mother and child, whether it's the bond between citizen and the national community to which they belong. Once you're in that more dangerous Rousseauian camp, the constant battle cry is always going to be to make the theoretical purity, to make good in practice on the theoretical purity of liberty. And at that point you're going to be fighting a constant war against everything until even in the present. So depending on which point you are in history, the battle cry will be against something else. Maybe it will be against motherhood in one period of time, maybe in another period of time it will be against nationhood. Today we're even seeing that it's a battle cry against nature itself, and the fact that nature itself imposes limits on people. And the thing I find hilarious about this is that at the same time that we're having these at the same time that this sort of hyper-aggressive liberalism is corroding all sorts of things that are incredibly valuable, it's disregarding those customary freedoms like freedom of speech, which are, I think, in fact, very important. So we live in a culture which is countenances OnlyFans, but is increasingly queasy about free speech. And so what kind of freedom is being venerated in a culture like it's completely topsy-turvy?
I think the problem too that you address in your article, and it's something that we are inevitably going to have to deal with, and this is something that's going to be coming up very quickly on us culturally, and it's going to hit the women first, but then also the men, is like you have the freedom to kind of pick whichever horse you may want and just sort of meander around in a stable without actually really going anywhere. But by the time you hit 35 and you realize, oh, I would actually have liked to made my way to a house and 2.1 kids and a loving family, I should have probably started out on that journey 7 years ago.
Exactly.
I think a lot of latent rage, for lack of a better term, is going to be expressed by women against men, and I think against society in general. And I think we're just basically starting to see that now. I think with kind of some of the, I don't know if you guys saw the video of the school teacher berating a student about not accepting another one of the students as being cat or cat gender in this attempt to kind of proselytize and convert past, a teacher's sort of normal acceptable boundaries to really kind of be a devouring mother, as Peterson might say, to her own pupils. I think what we're then going to see is this kind of writ large in society, which will be kind of I don't have my own kids, but there are kids about, so they're all our kids now. And I think we've actually seen this with some of the stuff coming out of America and out of the White House, direct from the desk of Joe Biden in the last few weeks, where it's like, these are all our children, we all need to take care of them. It will be sort of a collective subsumation of the family in order to satisfy the latent desires of motherhood that we have failed to fulfill for many women.
Well, it's happening over here, and I've done a hell of a lot of research recently for our podcast. I did a 2-hour breakdown on all of the, I say all of, a comprehensive literature review on the psychological, physiological and economic impacts of daycare, the daycare industrial complex. And that was brought on by the fact that Jeremy Hunt has now subsidised 30 hours a week of childcare from 9 months to 2 years old. And frankly, there is no clearer example of liberal market pressures acting as a solvent on the intimate bond between mother and child than that. Because, and there's a stunning meta-analysis that I looked at in Science magazine that saw that if babies at the start of the day are taken away from their mother at the peak of their blood cortisol and placed in a daycare setting, not only does the blood cortisol stay really high throughout the day, that becomes their sort of homeostasis of stress level throughout their adolescence. So mass daycare from the 1980s, and we're wondering why there are so many psychopathologies, why the level of antidepressant prescription is way, way up. Antidepressants, by the way, one of the leading drugs used in the suicides that they also increase the suicidal ideation of. So we are utterly underserving an entire generation of people for the sake of registering another activity, motherhood specifically, on the economic balance sheet. Because, again, Homo economicus is the primary mode of consideration of social organisation.
The idea, the classical economic idea that we're fundamentally profit maximising creatures rather than creatures, relational creatures, which is it takes one aspect of the human person which needs to be taken into account, the fact that oftentimes we are profit maximising creatures, and it sort of turns it into an ultimate value. It ultimately it completely fetishizes it. That's a really interesting. When are you going to be writing on that soon?
That's out. It's currently behind the paywall on Lotus, but I would like to.
How disappointing.
I would like to put something out there that makes the data a bit more accessible.
I see.
Do you think there's any credence to the argument that Mary Harrington points it out in her book, Feminism Against Progress, that back in the day, mothers would they would weave at home, right, where their kids can kind of run underfoot, but then as soon as everything moved to the factory, right, like you can't have a toddler like running around like heavy machinery. But as we kind of transition into this, post-office work-life balance with everybody just doing work from home, you have people like Mary or like Louise or these super moms who are able to kind of work and be productive members of society, but also while surrounded by their family. As long as you have Wi-Fi and a laptop, you can be, you can have 6 toddlers around you as long as you're able to chime in. Do you think that this will kind of level out this pressure, this sort of economic pressure against the family, or do you think that these trends are basically going to continue unabated until people decide to buck Homo economicus as a concept altogether?
I think we're at a bit of a fulcrum moment, because I think there's great potential there to do a technological version of a reversion to the 1450s, of where both members of the household are contributing something to the domestic economy, while also the mother can be more flexible, do more part-time, more remote work. Both Mary and Louise, I think, have acknowledged that that is a benefit of women only participating in the knowledge economy. However, that's a really valuable role. Yeah, so I was talking to Mary about this, not to leak DMs, but I said to her, I think I've sort of cracked her book a bit interrelated with the participation of many women in the knowledge economy. And that is that Simone de Beauvoir, in The Second Sex, going back to her, and this connects to Rousseau. Simone de Beauvoir turned around and said, okay, women's domain is not rationality because they've been deprived of the same education as men throughout history. Again, not necessarily my characterization, but it's hers. She says, because women are more likely to believe the anecdote told by a stranger cashing a check in the line at the bank or some confidant in the drawing room than a scientific study, that women's domain is the realm of the magical because they can speak certain inner truths into being. And she means magic there in the same way that, as David Hume had told Edmund Burke, the magic of Rousseau was that even though Rousseau's state of nature promise, his year zero total state where you'll have everything provided to you by the general will but you won't have to rely on anyone for anything, was a bunch of nonsense. The conviction with which he said it, the poetry with which he wrote it, was so powerful it inspired people to go out and eventually do the French Revolution. And so there's a kind of spellbinding in powerful rhetoric. If you dig into Simone de Beauvoir's citations, it's mainly just accounts from psychoanalytic journals. Absolutely no ability to verify this, but Simone de Beauvoir has compiled a consensus, a confected consensus of stories from women across the second sex, and it's become the feminist Bible. So it redirects that kind of grievance you were talking about earlier, that sort of revolutionary fervour of dissatisfied women that is currently building, has been building since the Industrial Revolution, has been fomented particularly since the Sexual Revolution that Beauvoir actively endorsed. It's created a self-generative revolutionary class that will lead to men and women being unisex participants in the market. And so what Mary's done and what Louise has done by onsetting a bunch of women my generation participating in the knowledge economy, sharing their story, saying that the pill has ruined my life, saying I wanted kids and I've started too late. It's created a new consensus of stories, quite literally weaving, as she ends in the line of her book, a new narrative that is counter to the feminist consensus that has captured an entire generation. So what they've done is quite clever. They've taken Beauvoir's insight and run with it and done that weaving that women were doing in the 1450s, but through storytelling online. And so that's actually a really encouraging thing. The only issue there, and this is a much broader conversation, is with the interjection of AI, you're going to have a lot of alienation from a lot of technical jobs, from the service industry, from even the data processing industry. Like a lot of people have turned around and said, okay, well, I'm an accountant or I'm a programmer. I guess I better start learning AI prompts instead, because I may as well prompt it properly to do my own job for me eventually. If loads of the knowledge economy and the vocational economy are wiped out, then the other side of it is we do know that there are a bunch of technocrats, whether it's in Davos, whether it's in Westminster, whether it's in the EU, who see us as Novel Harari's phrase, useless eaters, and they're considering what to do with us. And they want us to be the Rousseauian general will state that provides everything, just in the metaverse, so it's powered by renewables, so it's the minimal amount of resources but the maximum amount of consumption. And so we're at a bit of a crossroads here. We could go down the positive road. Unfortunately, there are political powers that would very much like to see us go down the negative road because it's more cost effective in their calculation.
And so in answer to Evan's question, then it's these sort of economic the various forms of social and economic conditioning that you're describing in terms of bringing about these mentalities, their effect is more a conditioning effect than a determining effect. It is still fundamentally up to us whether or not we could stand to benefit from the way in which the knowledge economy, as you say, the fact that more people are going to be working from home, that could, if we were to if we really were to make good on this moment, that could produce a renaissance in motherhood. Motherhood properly understood, but equally, as you say, there are forces that we need to fight on the other side. I mean, how do you think we can? Because one thing that I have noticed that I do think is problematic, to use the favorite left-wing phrase, which is incredibly tedious, but I think it is problematic, is that a lot of this conversation, I don't usually like playing identity politics. I think identity politics is for the most part an incredibly corrosive and divisive and tribal thing, and I don't want to have anything to do with it. But I'm a little more sympathetic to identity politics when it's dealing with the differences between men and women, because those differences are real and they need to be taken into account much more than other sort of dimensions on the intersectional
cat-gendered children.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Well, there you go. Exactly. But so I wonder if it's a slight problem, and it's not exclusively true, because you do have women like Louise Perry and Mary Harrington in this space, and it's very good that, and I know lots of a good number of young women who are being very influenced by them. But particularly on the online space, on TikTok and these other places, I've noticed that a lot of the people leading this conversation tend to be young, almost sort of vitalist men who, rather than calling on women and men, calling them to something higher, seem to like exposing and mocking women. And I was talking to a girl recently about this, and she said, even though I agree that sexual conservatism for women is a good idea, just as these men do on these meninist podcasts, when you speak to a woman on those podcasts who's 21 and let's say she slept with 25 people, slept with 28 people, you're speaking there to a woman who's broken, and by mocking her and exposing her to the ire of the internet, all you're really doing is compounding the precise shame which has brought about that situation in the first place. And so it's possible for these men to win the argument, but to completely lose the battle, because all we end up doing is fueling the cycle of resentment. I wonder if there are things that we can do better on that score, because it does seem to me that a lot of, even though I agree, as I say, with a lot of what's being said in that space in intellectual terms, the way it is said does matter, and it's possible to say that without being some kind of cringing lip.
Purity spiraling on the right is never pretty, and the people doing it tend to I don't know, I think they tend to reveal themselves more often than they think.
Yes.
It's usually just, bitter sort of incel-esque misogyny or unbelievably overactivated sort of disgust response towards any woman who doesn't fit your sort of perfect characteristics, which is a great way to make sure that nobody will ever touch you, and you can add to that 25% of guys under 30 who aren't getting laid.
Yeah. So I have a bit of a contentious take on this, and that is that I think, much like Marxism and liberalism, to use the same backside, red pill and feminism are the same. And that is because they are operating in that post-industrial paradigm where both men and women are competing in the unisex market for the same resources. They are naturally adversarial. If you look at most of red pill dating as I resent this hypothetical, abstract, platonic form of the Jezebel woman. If you understand that as them being proximate to a kind of resentment, it all begins to make sense. And that's why they want to win the micro battles rather than the war of re-engendering a kind of solidarity between the sexes so we can get along, so we can have wholesome relationships, so we can have families. Largely, they define themselves by material success.
Absolutely.
And this is why the body count conquest thing they never quite get over is unilateral. It's like, okay, this woman slept with 20 guys. Now that's terrible for women, whether it's to do with oxytocin pair bonding, whether that's to do with the amount of partners you have before you get married is a predicate divorce, whether that's risk because you don't know what kind of guy you're taking home and what he might do.
And to that extent, the red pill community is right to point those sorts of things out. But there is a caveat.
But also, lads, don't poison the well. Like, you're going out there and doing the exact same thing. And so do you really want to look your best friend in the eye when you've gone out and slept with his future wife? No. Do not create what is essentially the resentful feminists that are going to walk into some other guy's life as an emotional suicide bomber. Because that's another thing that's engendering this class of women that are going to hate men. If you're going to go around and say, I'm top G, I'm alpha, look at my Bugattis, again, another material marker rather than a sort of metaphysical wholesome marker, then you're saying, okay, I am entitled by nature of me being wise to whether pickup artist tactic or evolutionary psychology and biology that I have, I'm entitled to be the conquering warlord while all those betas just, languish off into the darkness. Whereas I would rather say, and this was the case for, again, hundreds of years pre-industrial, the family is the triumph of the everyman. And so this is the question. Do we want to go down the red pill path where it's adversarial, or do we want to change our heuristic away from economic, away from liberal concerns, back towards more wholesome, community-focused concerns where we put the creation of families as the primary consideration of a nation's success versus line go up, GDP, and the like?
I do think, I don't know, maybe it's just the waters that I swim in on Twitter and see algorithm telling me what I want, but I do think that kind of pickup artist red-pilled moment has actually largely passed us by. Maybe I've just grown out of it, but I think that actually having a family now is seen as like a massive status symbol, especially for guys, because you know that they're tied to something and they're invested in the future. I've spoken to some pretty wealthy people who would tell me that they would never hire a man for a serious role who didn't have a wife and child. And I think this is going to become much more common, especially as we, over the next 10 years, as we kind of pass peak millennialism, can we call it. Like, the Sex and the City myth is not dead, but it's certainly dying. I think that, I do think that we're about to see a change now. I mean, we can hypothesize all day about the technological influence on if it'll destroy the knowledge worker economy. I mean, maybe it'll destroy OnlyFans first. But I think that we're, I mean, a lot of technology is, driven forward by porn.
Yes.
But I do think that we're about to see a return to tradition, to use kind of a tired old phrase, because it will be the ultimate status signal in the reverse. In that I've rejected this, and much like having, you can go to the gym and be strong even though nobody has to be anymore. You can have a family even though you don't need one, because it's showing a certain level of commitment and forward thinking and forward planning. And I think that's actually the message to sell these kind of more Chad alpha guys, is that you're taking maybe a short-term sacrifice. I don't even know if I would call it a sacrifice in your 20s, but by the time you hit 35 and you've got a 5-year-old and a loving wife, this will be a massive benefit actually to your status and to your career.
The thing that I completely agree with everything you just said, but the thing I find most objectionable about the red pill community, and I agree with what Connor just said as well, is that their understanding of the world is fundamentally Darwinian. There's this idea that we are, so to speak, stranded on this isthmus of the middle state, and all we can really do is make use of whatever power we have to advance our own cause. And it's always in material terms. And so you'll notice in the red pill community as well, they very rarely speak in moral terms. They very rarely speak in terms of you should be called to something higher. This is like the Platonist understanding of morality, certainly the Christian one as well. Most religions have this idea that, yes, of course we have this sort of human isthmus, but then equally there's this heavenly realm, and that's sort of that constitutes a regulative ideal, and human beings are called to something higher. Whereas in the red pill universe, it's all that, gosh, it's just completely, it's completely competitive. It's just what's he got, and it's just a question. It's about acquisitiveness and doing the best with what you have. And so you'll notice that the way they speak almost always is, well, if you are a top G, and a top G, however defined, you know, you're over 6 foot, or you've got loads of money, you've got self-discipline, you've
been arrested in Romania.
You've been arrested in well, he has now, and he's been charged. But anyway. All this sort of thing, then you can, if you can get away with doing these things and that you don't really reap the negative consequences of it, then, you know, why should I be called to something higher? We need to point to the fact that what use is it having all that self-discipline to go to the gym, to be hardworking, to make loads of money, if in the most important aspect of your life, namely, you know, your life as a relational being, or whether it's as a father, a wife, that sort of thing, you are completely drowning in your own appetites.
Yeah. There's nowhere to go once you hit it. Like, once you've got the Bugatti and the 3-figure body count, it's like, what else is there to do? Like, go to 4 figures in a second Bugatti? Like, it's just boring after a certain point.
It's like being one of the beautiful ones in the mouse utopia, where you sit around grooming yourself to perfection all day while your entire civilization is deteriorating into cannibalism and sterility around you. One of the things that I think is at the heart of this, and this comes back right to the start to the liberalism question, is what are you proximate to? And this is the divide. Are you a materialist, or do you have some kind of metaphysical calling that you exist, like a higher ideal, in proximity to? This is kind of what C.S. Lewis defines love as. And that is that, okay, if you believe in God, he emanates love, creation was the first act of love, and therefore, if you're trying to embody love, you're only ever emulating it, but you can't achieve that. So you are in a noble distance from the highest possible ideal, the creative thing. And so your success, your love, etc., can never be too much, because you'll never displace that ideal, but you're always trying to reach it. And so it engenders a sense of humility in you. With liberalism, with the sort of Sigma male grind set kind of thing, you have nothing above you, it's just you. And okay, that then comes down to what's in the way of my success, because you can't quantify autonomy. You can quantify money, you can quantify body count, but you can't quantify autonomy. And this is why liberalism goes from political liberalism, where it looks at, okay, is the state impeding on me, to comprehensive liberalism is advice, social stigma, relationships impeding on my atomized success.
Even if it doesn't have the force of law to it.
Exactly, yeah. Is having a kid going to take away from my career? That was, I think, Michelle Williams got up at the Oscars and said, if I didn't have an abortion, I wouldn't have this statue. And that's it.
Good trade.
Exactly. Well, that's madness. But this is the thing. Everything then becomes a crusade against the only things which are standing in your way, because you can't quantify how successful you are. All you can quantify is, who do you resent from standing in your way? For the red pill community, that's feminism. For feminism, that's men. For comprehensive liberalism, that's largely children or their own biology. If you don't have a proximate ideal that you coexist with, that you're striving towards, but you know you'll never necessarily reach, you don't have the humility to not dismantle everything in your path.
I do think that the red pill community does deserve a little bit more credit, because I don't regard it as just another iteration of liberalism. It certainly has lots of common elements, but one thing that they do have is that they do have a very Nietzschean emphasis on the fact that in order to exercise maximal individual power, you actually need to cultivate certain virtues. And so I think that one of the reasons why it is appealing to young men is precisely because it plugs a lot of the gap that liberalism has made them feel. You know, if you watch Andrew Tate videos and the like, they do say a lot of it is quite stirring for young men. I can understand why, you know, an emphasis on, you know, hard work and duty. That, I mean, there are certain things that are emphasized there which are to that extent anti-liberal, because he's saying, look, get out of bed, do this, you know, be self-disciplined, cultivate these, what Nietzsche would call these knightly aristocratic virtues, so that you can exercise maximal individual power. Don't just be a mediocre, you know, vassal to your own appetite. The thing that we need to point out in the rebel community is that while they emphasize self-discipline in all of those relatively, you know, unimportant spheres, in the most important sphere, namely your life as a relational creature, embedded in a community with a family, maybe with a wife, maybe with children, like how are you going, like if you can be self-disciplined in the gym, you know, you can be self-disciplined in that domain as well. And it's much more important that you are, because then you're actually, rather than just being some sort of heroic, you know, knight in a vacuum, you're actually contributing to the flourishing of your own community. And like, what could be more, you know, what could be more galvanizing to young men than to tell them that that could be their future.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Bugatti is just a car.
Exactly. Well, gents, I mean, I could do this. I always say this, but I could do this for much longer, but unfortunately we are out of time. Connor, you must come back again.
Yeah, happy to.
Yeah,
Time for us.
One of these days. Evan, thanks as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. We shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.